October, 218 BC. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio stands upon a limestone ridge overlooking the Rhone, watching his scouts return from the northern horizon. The sun climbed 3 hours ago, and the Roman military machine, the most disciplined force in the Mediterranean, is already settling into its rhythmic, orderly camp. Scipio's face radiates the quiet confidence of a man who trusts in the absolute laws of geography. He has 2 legions at his back, thousands of specialized auxiliaries, and the strategic certainty that Italy is an island protected by a wall of ice. The First Punic War lasted decades, but it ended in Roman triumph. Spain is being subdued. This current threat will be snuffed out by winter, maybe sooner. The Senate itself said the Alps are impassable for an army. After the first frost, the Carthaginian upstart will have no choice but to retreat to Africa. He'll see reason, everyone yields to the mountains eventually. Scipio believes this completely. He is catastrophically wrong. That same morning, in the Senate house at the Forum, the mood is euphoric. The fathers of Rome note with satisfaction that the Carthaginian military is a patchwork of mercenaries, their leadership desperate, their supply lines non-existent. General officers tell anyone who will listen that a campaign in the north would be a walkover compared to the siege of Lilybaeum. The question isn't whether the Carthaginian will be stopped, but precisely when, November, or by the first snowfall at the latest. The logic seems unassailable. Rome has crushed every Italian tribe it has faced in a century. The Etruscans were broken, the Samnites fell, even Pyrrhus, with his war elephants, was forced back across the sea. Carthage, the great merchant power, lost its fleet and its pride in the last war. And now, with the entire manpower of a unified Italy behind them, Rome is turning its gaze toward a total conquest of the West. Every calculation, every assessment, every scout report says the same thing: no army can march through the clouds and survive. But there is another part to this equation, and it gnaws at the Roman consciousness even in their moment of security: Hannibal. Hannibal, who should have stayed in Spain a year ago. Hannibal, whose father was defeated, whose city is crippled by treaties, whose treasury is supposedly empty. Hannibal, who stands against the most powerful republic on earth with no allies, no hope of reinforcement, and no rational path forward. And yet, the ghost marches on. Chapter 1. By the year 218 BC, the Roman Republic had become a machine that thrived on the absolute certainty of its own dominance. For over a century, the Roman Senate had operated on the unassailable logic that geography was their greatest ally and the Mediterranean was their backyard. To the Roman mind, the Italian peninsula was not merely a piece of land, but a fortress designed by the gods themselves. To the west and east lay the sea where their newly forged navy held sway, and to the north sat the Alps, a jagged, vertical wall of ice and granite that served as the ultimate gatekeeper. The military records in the Temple of Saturn told a story of inevitable victory. Rome had crushed the Etruscans, absorbed the Samnites, and sent the legendary Pyrrhus of Epirus retreating across the Adriatic after he realized that for every Roman legion he broke, 2 more would rise to take its place. The First Punic War had been a grueling 20-year marathon that proved Rome could outlast, outbuild, and outspend the merchant princes of Carthage. After the peace of 241 BC, the Republic had stripped Carthage of Sicily and Sardinia, effectively turning the Carthaginian Empire into a hollow shell. The logic of the legions dictated that any future conflict with Carthage would follow a predictable, manageable pattern. Roman intelligence reports and strategic assessments all pointed to the same conclusion: if the young Hannibal Barca wanted a war, he would have to fight it on Rome's terms. He would either have to launch a suicidal naval invasion against the superior Roman fleet or attempt to grind through the Roman-held territories in Spain and Sicily. But the northern frontier remained the cornerstone of Roman security. The consuls and their staff officers viewed the Alps with a sense of mathematical detachment. The peaks were over 10,000 feet high, the passes were choked with snow by October, and the local Gallic tribes were as treacherous as the weather. To move a modern army, thousands of infantry, specialized cavalry, and a massive baggage train, across such terrain was not just a military risk, it was a physical impossibility. Every principle of strategic calculation suggested that any commander foolish enough to attempt the crossing would find his army buried under avalanches long before they saw the Po Valley. In the sun-drenched villas of Rome, the talk was not of defense, but of expansion. They were turning their power toward the complete industrial and military subjugation of the West, convinced that the Alpine Wall was a permanent guarantee of their safety. The Republic sat in a state of euphoric confidence, certain that the mathematics of war had already determined the outcome. They believed they understood the reality of the world perfectly. They were about to discover that Hannibal Barca did not care for their mathematics. Chapter 2. In the winter of 218 BC, the Curia Julia in Rome did not echo with the sounds of panic, but with the hollow, resonant tone of institutional arrogance. Publius Cornelius Scipio stood before the gathered elders of the Senate, his traveling cloak still stained with the dust of the northern roads, presenting a report that defied the very foundations of Roman military intelligence. He spoke of a Carthaginian shadow moving toward the Alpine passes, not a small raiding party, but a full-scale invasion force. He described a commander, Hannibal, who was not behaving like a rational general of a defeated city-state, but like a man who intended to rewrite the laws of nature. The reaction from the high-backed benches was not fear, but a dismissive, patronizing skepticism. To the venerable senators, Scipio's warnings were not seen as strategic foresight, but as the warmongering fantasies of a commander eager for a larger budget and a more prestigious command. The prevailing sentiment was one of supreme comfort. Rome had already sent legions to Spain and Sicily, they had the chessboard covered. The idea that an army of tens of thousands, accompanied by cavalry and heavy beasts, would attempt to navigate the narrow, frozen death traps of the high Alps was treated as a joke, a logistical absurdity that no sane mind would entertain. Leading senators argued that even if the Barca boy were foolish enough to enter the mountains, the peaks would do Rome's work for them. They spoke of the mathematics of survival, the lack of forage, the thinning air, and the hostile tribes that lived in the clouds. They viewed Scipio's alarm as an insult to the unassailable logic of their geography. To them, Hannibal was a ghost story, a phantom meant to frighten children, not a genuine threat to the heart of the Republic. They remained convinced that the war would be fought on the distant shores of Iberia or the familiar waters of the Mediterranean. As Scipio looked upon the faces of the men who ruled the known world, he saw a dangerous euphoria, the same blindness that precedes every great catastrophe in history. The Senate voted to maintain their current course, treating the northern frontier as a secondary concern, a mere footnote in their grand strategy. They believed they were being prudent and measured. They were, in reality, signing the death warrants of tens of thousands of Roman citizens. The Senate had reached a logical conclusion based on a world they thought they understood, completely unaware that the man they dismissed was already standing on the roof of the world, looking down at them. Chapter 3. High above the clouds, where the air turns thin and the silence is broken only by the scream of the wind, the Carthaginian army ceased to be an organized military force and became a desperate line of ghosts. The cold miracle was not a moment of divine intervention, but a grueling, agonizing testament to human will. As Hannibal's column pushed through the highest passes of the Alps, the unassailable logic of Rome began to manifest as a physical enemy. Men did not just die, they vanished. Pack mules laden with vital grain lost their footing on the narrow, ice-slicked precipices, tumbling into the white abyss with a sickening silence that haunted the survivors. The descent was more treacherous than the climb. The late October sun had melted the top layer of fresh snow, creating a lethal lubricant over the old, hardened ice underneath. Thousands of infantrymen slid into the ravines, their screams swallowed by the mountain fog. Even the elephants, the great psychological titans of the Carthaginian war machine, had become emaciated, their leathery skin cracked by the frost, as they were prodded down slopes that no creature of their size was meant to traverse. By the time the jagged peaks finally began to give way to the foothills of the Po Valley, the cost was laid bare in staggering, catastrophic numbers. Hannibal had begun the crossing with nearly 50,000 men, he emerged with barely 26,000. Half of his army had been claimed by the mountains, buried under avalanches or left to freeze in the high passes. His cavalry was depleted, his soldiers were walking skeletons wrapped in rotting furs, and his remaining elephants were more pathetic than terrifying. Mathematically, the Carthaginian army was broken. Strategically, they were finished. According to every Roman military manual, an army that had suffered 50% casualties before even engaging the enemy was a force that had already lost. Yet, as the survivors stumbled onto the green plains of northern Italy, they possessed something more dangerous than numbers, the total element of surprise. They had done what was deemed impossible. They had bypassed the Roman fleet, ignored the fortified coastal roads, and literally descended from the heavens. The Roman outposts, which had spent weeks looking toward the sea or the western horizon, were suddenly looking up. The impossible was no longer a theory debated in the Senate, it was standing on Italian soil, shivering, starving, and ready to kill. Hannibal had paid for the surprise with the lives of half his men, but in doing so, he had shattered the Roman sense of reality. The fortress had been breached from above. Chapter 4. In the wake of the impossible crossing, the Roman military hierarchy retreated into the only thing that felt solid, the manual. As reports filtered south of a bedraggled, starving Carthaginian force emerging from the mountains, the Roman commanders did not see a lethal predator, they saw a broken remnant. They viewed the war through the lens of tradition, a rigid doctrine that dictated how civilized nations conducted battle. To the Roman mind, the Carthaginian presence was a temporary geographical error that could be corrected by a single, decisive set-piece engagement. They were determined to meet Hannibal in the open, in the sunshine, with their lines perfectly dressed and their eagles held high. Scouts, men who had lived on the frontier and traded with the local Gauls, brought back frantic warnings that the broken army was anything but. They spoke of Numidian horsemen who moved like shadows, of Iberian mercenaries who fought with a savage, unconventional fluidity, and of Hannibal's tendency to study the terrain as much as the enemy. The scouts warned of hidden ravines and the treacherous, tall grasses of the Pa Valley, suggesting that the Carthaginian was not looking for a fair fight, but a slaughter. These warnings were dismissed by the high command as the nerves of low-born men. In the eyes of the Roman aristocracy, war was a test of virtue and formation, not a game of hide-and-seek in the mud. The Roman commanders clung to the appeal to tradition with a fervor that bordered on the religious. They believed that the sheer weight of the Roman legion, the heavy scutum, the disciplined pilum throw, the relentless advance of the triarii, would inevitably crush a ragtag collection of mercenaries. They marched north not to defend, but to tidy up a mess. They ignored the fact that Hannibal had spent his entire life studying their movements, and that the very tradition they relied upon was a predictable script he had already memorized. As the legions tramped toward the Ticinus River, the rhythmic thud of thousands of sandals served as a heartbeat of overconfidence. They moved with the grace of a giant that did not believe anything smaller could hurt it. They were looking for a battlefield that looked like a parade ground, expecting an enemy that would stand still and die with dignity. They refused to accept that the rules of engagement had changed the moment the first elephant stepped off the alpine ice. Roman tradition was about to meet Carthaginian reality, and for the first time in a generation, the tradition was about to snap. Chapter 5. The cold morning of the winter solstice at the Trebia River began with a calculated insult. Hannibal, having studied the Roman temperament, sent his Numidian horsemen to harass the Roman camp at dawn, drawing the legions out before they could eat or properly arm themselves against the biting cold. The Roman commanders, blinded by their own superior doctrine, took the bait. They ordered nearly 40,000 men to wade across the chest-deep, ice-choked waters of the Trebia. By the time the legionaries reached the opposite bank, they were not the iron-willed conquerors of tradition, they were shivering, exhausted men with blue lips and hands so frozen they could barely grip their gladius. Hannibal, conversely, had kept his men warm by fires, fed, and even ordered them to rub oil onto their bodies to insulate against the frost. As the Roman lines finally formed their rigid, traditional squares, the pride of Mediterranean warfare, they found themselves staring at a nightmare of fluid geometry. They expected a static wall of infantry that they could grind down through sheer weight of numbers. Instead, they were met by a crescent of light infantry that gave ground just enough to draw the Roman center deeper into a trap. The moment of realization was a sickening shock to the Roman system. As the legions surged forward, believing they were winning the center, Hannibal's heavy cavalry shattered the Roman wings. Suddenly, the invincible Roman infantry was exposed. It was at this precise moment that the logic of the legions collapsed. From a hidden, brush-filled ravine behind the Roman lines, Hannibal's brother Mago surged forth with 2,000 hand-picked elite troops. The Romans, who prided themselves on never being surprised, found themselves attacked from the rear, the flanks, and the front simultaneously. The Trebia did not turn red from a fair fight, it turned red because Roman discipline was used as a weapon against itself. The more the Romans tried to stick to their traditional formations, the more they crowded together, becoming a panicked mass of targets for the Carthaginian spears. The superior tactics they had relied on for a century were being read like an open book and discarded. For the first time in their history, the Roman soldier looked into the eyes of an enemy who didn't just want to fight them, but who understood them better than they understood themselves. As the survivors scrambled back into the freezing water, the unassailable logic of Roman military superiority lay drowned in the mud of the riverbank. Chapter 6. The defeat at the Trebia had left more than physical scars on the Roman psyche, it had introduced a new, primal element of terror that the legions were ill-equipped to process. For the Roman infantrymen, war had always been a human affair, a collision of shields, a contest of stamina, and the familiar grit of the blade. But on the windswept plains of Italy, they were suddenly confronted by the African beast. The Carthaginian elephants, looming through the morning mists like grey, mountain-sized apparitions, shattered the Roman sense of order. To a soldier from a rural Italian village, these were not merely tactical assets, they were supernatural monsters that nullified the protection of the scutum. The ground trembled beneath their weight, and the terrifying, metallic trumpeting of the beasts triggered an ancient, instinctive panic that no amount of drill could suppress. Yet, if the elephants were the hammer that broke the spirit, it was the Numidian cavalry that acted as the invisible blade. The Roman military tradition was built on the dominance of the heavy infantry, with the cavalry traditionally serving as a secondary, supportive wing. Hannibal's Numidians turned this hierarchy on its head. They fought like ghosts, refusing to engage in the honest melee that the Romans understood. They rode without saddles or bridles, guiding their small, hardy horses with nothing but a switch and a voice, appearing from the flanks to rain javelins upon the Roman lines before vanishing into the dust. They were an enemy that could not be caught, a shadow that bled the legions dry while remaining perpetually out of reach. The psychological toll was devastating. The Roman legionary began to feel that the very rules of the world had been inverted. Their superior discipline, which had conquered the peninsula, now felt like a cage that kept them trapped while the African beast and the desert horsemen tore at their edges. The Roman soldiers began to speak of Hannibal not as a man, but as a sorcerer who had brought the terrors of the wild world into the sacred heart of Italy. Every rustle in the tall grass and every distant trumpet blast became a source of dread. The logic of the Roman soldier, the belief that strength and formation would always prevail, was being eroded by a psychological warfare that targeted the soul as much as the body. They were no longer just fighting an army, they were fighting their own rising conviction that the gods of the mountains and the plains had abandoned Rome. Chapter 7. By the spring of 217 BC, the Roman sense of strategic certainty had been replaced by a frantic, vengeful desperation. The new consul, Gaius Flaminius, was a man of action who viewed the previous defeats as mere lapses in Roman aggression rather than failures of Roman logic. He led his legions northward, convinced that the way to stop Hannibal was not to study him, but to hunt him. Hannibal, understanding this impetuousness, played upon the Roman ego like a master musician. He bypassed Flaminius's fortified positions, marching his army through the supposedly impassable Arno marshes, an agonizing trek that cost Hannibal an eye to infection, just to place himself between the Roman army and the city of Rome itself. Flaminius, incensed by the Carthaginians' audacity and the sight of the scorched Italian countryside, gave chase. He followed Hannibal toward the narrow defile along the north shore of Lake Trasimene. The geography of the lake was a natural funnel, a thin strip of road squeezed between steep, wooded hills and the deep, cold waters of the lake. On the morning of June 21, a thick, white mist rose from the water, blanketing the valley in a ghostly shroud. To the Roman commanders, the fog was a mere weather condition, a minor inconvenience to their march. To Hannibal, it was a cloak. The Roman column, 30,000 strong, marched into the defile in their traditional order, stretched out in a line miles long. They were the blind legion, moving with confidence into a space they had not scouted, because their logic told them an army of Hannibal's size would be retreating, not waiting. They couldn't see that the wooded heights above them were crawling with Carthaginian veterans, Numidian horsemen, and Gallic mercenaries, all standing in absolute, predatory silence. The signal was a single trumpet blast that seemed to come from the sky itself. Within seconds, the logical world of the Roman soldier dissolved into a whirlwind of bronze and blood. The Carthaginians surged down the slopes, hitting the Roman flank at every point simultaneously. There was no room to form the maniples, no space to throw the pilum, and no time to realize that the trap had been set days in advance. The mist, once a nuisance, became a veil for a slaughter. For 3 hours, the Romans fought with the frantic bravery of cornered animals, but they were fighting geography as much as steel. Thousands were pushed back into the lake, weighted down by their expensive armor, drowning in the shallows as they tried to swim to safety. Flaminius himself was cut down, his dream of a proper Roman victory dying with him in the mud. By midday, the mist cleared to reveal a landscape of total ruin. 15,000 Romans lay dead, another 15,000 were captured. The largest trap in military history had been sprung, proving once again that in Hannibal's world, the most dangerous weapon was the one the Romans refused to see. Chapter 8. The news of the disaster at Lake Trasimene hit Rome not like a report of a lost battle, but like a seismic rupture in the earth itself. For the first time in centuries, the city of Rome felt the cold, physical breath of an invader on its neck. The 0 hour had arrived. The streets that usually hummed with the commerce of an empire were suddenly choked with a different sound, the low, vibrating hum of collective panic. The unassailable logic that had sustained the Republic, the belief that the war would always happen somewhere else, on someone else's land, had evaporated. In the Forum, the usual political maneuvering was replaced by a raw, primitive terror. People gathered in frantic clusters, eyes searching the northern horizon as if they expected to see the African elephants cresting the Janiculum hill at any moment. The Senate, so recently dismissive of Scipio's warmongering, now met in emergency sessions that lasted deep into the night, their voices strained and hollow. The unthinkable had become the imminent. Hannibal was no longer a ghost in the mountains, he was a few days' march away, and the road to the gates was virtually open. The military-age men had been sent north and slaughtered, the city was defended by little more than the elderly, the very young, and the frantic prayers of the Vestal virgins. The panic was not merely about the threat of fire and sword, but about the total collapse of the Roman worldview. If the Alps could not stop him, and the legions could not stop him, and the lakes and rivers could not stop him, then what was left? The Roman citizens began to look at their massive walls, the Servian walls, not as symbols of pride, but as the thin skin of a dying animal. The psychological trauma of being hunted in their own home was so profound that it manifested in a sudden, desperate return to the irrational. Ancient prophecies were unearthed, and sacrifices were doubled. The high-minded logic of the Republic was being stripped away, revealing a city that was rediscovering what it felt like to be afraid of the dark. Amidst this chaos, the cry, Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, echoed through the alleys, turning into a mantra of despair. Yet, in this moment of absolute vulnerability, a new, grimmer reality began to take hold. The panic was slowly hardening into something else. The Romans were realizing that their traditional ways of war were dead, and if the Republic was to survive this 0 hour, it would have to become something far more ruthless and stubborn than it had ever been. The era of the civilized, set-piece battle was over. The era of total, existential survival had begun. Hannibal was coming, and Rome, for the first time in its history, was truly alone. Chapter 9. Decades after the fires of the Punic Wars had cooled, in the quiet courtyards of retired Roman commanders and the hushed archives of the Senate, the name of Hannibal Barca remained a subject of grim, scholarly obsession. The surviving generals of that era, men who had eventually seen Rome rise from the ashes to raze Carthage to the ground, did not find peace in their victory. Instead, they found themselves haunted by the lessons of the defeated. In their memoirs and late-night debates, they began to admit a truth they could never have voiced during the 0 hour, that they had not been outfought by a superior army, but out-imagined by a superior mind. The consensus among the survivors was unanimous. They realized that Hannibal's greatest weapon was never the stampeding elephant or the lightning-fast Numidian horseman, it was his total, baffling refusal to be bound by what was mathematically possible. The Roman military machine had been built on the principle of the unassailable logic, the belief that war was a series of predictable equations involving manpower, geography, and tradition. Hannibal had looked at those equations and simply discarded them. He had seen the Alps not as a wall, but as a bridge. He had seen the Roman obsession with tradition not as a strength, but as a blindfold. General officers who had served at the Trebia or survived the slaughter at Cannae wrote with a lingering, barely concealed frustration. They admitted that they had been defeated by a man who fought as if reality were a fluid thing. One veteran, reflecting on the psychological collapse of the legions, noted that the Romans had been slaves to the map, while Hannibal had treated the map like a canvas. He didn't just break their formations, he broke their faith in the world they thought they knew. He forced Rome to acknowledge that logic is a fragile shield when faced with a foe who is willing to pay any price to achieve the impossible. Ultimately, the transformation of Rome into a world-spanning empire was born from the trauma Hannibal inflicted. To defeat him, Rome had to abandon its own rigid calculations and adopt a grimmer, more irrational stubbornness. They learned that the only answer to a man who refuses to accept defeat is to become a nation that refuses to accept death. As the old generals looked back, they realized that Hannibal's ghost still walked the halls of the Senate. He had taught them the most painful lesson of all, that in the theater of war, the most dangerous enemy is the one who understands that mathematics can be cheated, geography can be defied, and reality itself can be bent by the sheer force of a human will.